I was inspired by this book. I don't know if has anybody read this. It's called Humanizing the Economy. It's by John Rastakis, who just resigned recently as the executive director of the BC Cooperatives Association. And he was one of the founding members of this study tour in Italy. And it's just a very interesting book. It's sort of a cook's tour of cooperatives around the world, but also his view on why things have changed in the world and why it's really important, sort of reflecting back on Bill's questions, why cooperatives are more important now than ever, and that whole piece around reciprocity and being heard and participating in cooperatives. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we go forward. So now hopefully okay, so the context, sorry, Joyce, am I in your way?
No, it's fine.
The context of where we are right now. Obviously, there is a big crisis in the global economic system. I don't need to tell you that. You know, and I think it was in 2008, October 3rd, the U.S. Congress passed an $8 billion bailout for Wall Street, and the same thing happened in England and Europe. So that's pretty significant. There's a report that was recently published by Oxfam UK, I think, and it said the 85 richest people have as much wealth as the poorest 50% of the entire global population, which is about 3.5 billion people. So that's pretty significant, I think, in terms of dramatic shifts in wealth and inequality, which we've heard so much about, the 1% movement. The global financial system really is dominated by a large group of large multinationals and banks right now. So I think this is a really interesting time to be involved in cooperatives because there really is a hunger for alternatives. And I love the Wells tagline because I think it's such a great tagline for the times that we live in. So, just looking at co-ops, what if there was a business model that was democratic, that we could all participate in, was rooted in our local community, would have values and principles associated with it, put common good before private gain, and, tangible results, and was successful and resilient. And there's some studies that show that actually, particularly in the US and Europe, cooperatives during this most recent economic recession came out of it stronger than ever. So there is some, historical fact that shows that cooperatives actually do quite well in a time of turmoil, economic turmoil. So we're just going to delve into the history a little bit. I don't know if people realize this, just sort of what the birth of cooperatives was. That was England in the 1880s. There was a lot of, as we know, the Industrial Revolution was going on. So a lot of small landowners that farmed land moved to the cities to work in mills and in factories. And a lot of machines replaced artisans. So that's, recently there's been this whole, I guess I would call it artisanal resurgence, which is a great thing because a lot of that disappeared during the Industrial Revolution of the 1880s. Very poor working conditions. There were some pictures when I was doing the research for this that were really quite upsetting. Limited democracy, a lot of people, as I said before, moving to the cities, and birth of the cooperative movement. So I think a lot of people have heard about Rochdale, which is a group of weavers, community activists, and unionists that founded a very small cooperative, a member-owned store in 1844, and established some basic business principles. But one of the most interesting things about this, everybody knows about the store, and or a lot of people know that was the birth of the cooperative movement. But one of the first things that they established was a temperance hotel, because they felt it wasn't only about getting together to purchase goods at a cheaper price. It was also giving something back to the community, and in that days there was quite a significant issue with alcoholism, and so they felt that was really an important contributor to society to establish this temperance hotel. 10 years later in England, the co-op movement had grown to 1,000 co-ops. So that's pretty amazing in the space of 10 years that happened. So when you look at what's around, there's sort of basically three economic approaches. Capitalism as we know it now, which is maximization of profit for the people that own the capital. communism, which is social need controlled by the state, and cooperativism, which is what we're looking at. There was a time when communism and cooperativism were quite closely aligned, but over time there was a difference in approach, and those have sort of separated. Largely because of the need for more democratic participation that evolved from in terms of the way communism evolved over history. So I just took this slide from the Ontario Cooperative Association website. I think it's really interesting because it just talks about how, cooperatives versus capitalism, and how, in terms of how long they outlive each other. I don't know if you can read this. I'll just read it because it's a little fuzzy. 3 recent studies demonstrate that cooperative enterprises have significantly higher survival rates than other business corporations. The co-op advantage becomes more prominent over time. So this is after 1 year, 94% of co-ops are still in business, only 75% of corporations, and then it goes down to 10 years. So I think I'm keeping my fingers crossed that the West End well is in this positive 44.3%, which I'm sure will be. So what is a co-op? And I just think it's important to have a look at this in terms of when you think about what is important as a member, and for me, for all of us as individuals, how we can contribute. So it's sort of an autonomous association of people to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations. So I think those are really important because it's not only relating to, or at least the West End Mall is going to be a multi-stakeholder cooperative, which is a bit different from a consumer cooperative where people just come together maybe to pool their capital to get goods at a lower price, which is how Mountain Equipment Co-op started. And co-ops are values-based, and I think that's a really important thing too, to think about what are my values, and how can I share those with the people that I'm working with at the West End Well, or that are other members. So, self-help, self-responsibility, democracy, equality, equity, and solidarity. And I think what's interesting is some of those things were things that came out, at least in the conversation that Joyce, Jane, and I had, just in terms of why we felt heard in the positive, when Bill had asked us to think of that positive example. And honesty, openness, social responsibility, and caring for others. Really key things. Principles of cooperatives, and you see this is a lot of stuff that I took from the international cooperative sort of sites. So, again, we see democracy, we see economic participation, autonomy and independence, education, training, and information, collaboration amongst cooperatives. I know Bill has mentioned to me how open other co-ops have been to the West End Well in terms of sharing their books and opening their books, sharing what their challenges of startup were and how they dealt with it. And really importantly, I think, is this last one, which is concern for community. So co-ops today, there are so many co-ops, 1 billion members in 84 countries. And I think this one was really interesting, the second stat, that the top 300 co-ops employ 20% more people than all the multinationals. So co-ops seem to be sort of often, forgotten or relegated. I did an MBA at Western, which some people regard as, the best business school in Canada, whatever. I cannot remember one class where we talked about cooperatives. Cooperatives just really didn't exist, which is very odd, considering that, in Canada, 1 in 3 members apparently are members, 1 in 3 people are members of a cooperative. We used to say at Mountain Equipment Co-op, I was saying this to Brock, that we were kind of proud that at 3.5 million members, we were larger than any other political movement, if you wanted to call that, in Canada. Huge in India, 236 million in China, same, and even in the USA, 1 in 4. So those were really interesting stats to me, considering that it's sort of a forgotten business model, if you want to call it. In New England alone, there's 9,000 cooperatives with 9.5 million members that employ 55,000 people that have, I can't even read my own handwriting, that's embarrassing, 14 billion in revenue and 2 billion in assets. So that's just incredible to me. 29,000 cooperatives in total in the U.S. economy. And you know, I think in some of the advantages of those co-ops is that they're encouraging local healthy food, organic, fair trade, all those great things, and they actually survived and grew in the recent global recession. So, you know, they really are the best kept secret in community economics, and largely they aren't studied by business schools or whatever, and underutilized by government and community development organizations. I think it is changing though, and I think part of this, even the West End Well process has engaged a lot of people, and hopefully will engage even more in the co-op sort of movement. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience in Italy. This area, Emilia-Romagna, is a province in Italy that has 4 million members. It's the major city there is Bologna. It's very well known for, it's famous as the home of places like a lot of food. It's the food basket of Italy, so home of Parma ham and Modena, where a lot of the balsamic vinegar comes from. Really nice wine, of course, as everywhere in Italy has. Also home of like Ferrari and Ducati, for those of you who are motorcycle fans, and places like that. So a lot of the you know, very high-end racing cars are there. A lot of 30 to 40% of the GDP is based on cooperatives, and 3 of 4 members of everybody who lives in Emilia-Romagna are members. 10% are employed by cooperatives, and it's pretty much, this region is very unusual in Italy, especially today, that it has pretty much full employment, which in Italy there's some areas where unemployment is quite high. And this has been largely encouraged a lot through government regulation, and just even organizations like the Catholic Church over time have really encouraged this kind of participation and working together. And the whole idea of the cross-sector cooperation has been very, you know, co-ops helping each other has been very, very powerful. Co-ops, in not only in Emilia-Romagna, but in Italy in total, 38% of the retailing total retail is controlled by cooperatives. There's a very large food co-op, and I forget what the first, I think it's just called the co-op in most places. So if you've been to even small towns in Italy, pretty much every small town has a co-op, which is part of this larger organization, and they do an amazing job for a huge cooperative of member engagement. We actually, as part of this, went to their head offices, and they met with the person who's in charge of member engagement, and you know, they did all kinds of things. They had panels in most cities where members could sit on. And the most popular one, as you can imagine, was the food tasting, you know, tasting new products on community as well. It really gave back, and it was quite, you know, I guess compared to Mountain and Kumiko, it was quite inspiring in terms of ways to engage your membership. And one of the things I'd like to address a little bit is this co-op effect. So in 2000, they did a study of a few of the towns. So 2 of the towns, Imola and Faenza, were actually in Emilia-Romagna. This town, which I won't even try to pronounce, is actually in northern Tuscany. But there were no co-ops there. Imola is really famous. They make a lot of ceramics there, and that are sold all over the world. There's huge ceramic cooperatives. And it was interesting that it showed that there was less crime, there was more social participation, things like voter engagement, health was better, higher levels of education in the towns where a large proportion of the were employed by co-ops. So I found that to be very interesting in terms of when you think about why is that? What is engaging those people? Is there something about that community sense of belonging to a co-op that actually makes you makes you more engaged civically and a better citizen? So when we look at globalization today, you know, what's happening with capital and whatever, it is a bit, it's replicating a little bit of what happened in the Industrial Revolution in England in the 1800s. And, you know, there's economic power is being centralized a lot in the hands, even more of large corporations. I think one of the positive things about the co-ops is that we can, and I know Bill and I have engaged in the past in this, and a lot of conversations about how it can protect local economies through fair trade. Like, you know, let's think about our local economy, and there's a lot of movements around the world that are really focused on this small and local. Reforming trade practices, actually a lot of cooperatives have been very active in the fair trade movement and have, you know, moved that forward considerably. And it is a viable alternative to the free market model of economics and business. And because I think there's a much greater emphasis on sustainability and on social justice. So also it's a model for mobilizing broader society around common issues like food security. I know that Robin gave a very interesting talk on that whole issue of food security. Even when you think back to the Rochdale Cooperative and their focus on temperance or, you know, improving the alcoholic problem. I think it's able, you know, it's harder and harder, I think, for new businesses to start and survive in a global economy. You know, when you think about it, it's amazing to me that there's so many, we were just talking about, when you're talking about coffee shops, like, you know, with Starbucks and large corporations, I think it's getting harder. When you think about bookshops, that's a really interesting example too, like large books, you know, large scale booksellers like Chapters and Indigo is, you know, the demise of the smaller business. Community empowerment, and I think people can connect and become more proactive citizens because there's a sense of engagement in the co-op, that people participate and, you know, talk about issues that are really important to them. So I wanted to talk a little bit about social cooperatives because this was really interesting, and I don't think we've seen as much of that in Canada as exists in some other countries. And I think, I just thought as an aside, it's sort of an interesting topic because, you know, we also live through sort of more cost-cutting and privatization. And in some countries, cooperatives have sort of risen up to reach those gaps that we see in the healthcare system and in human systems. This has happened a lot in Italy and in some other European countries. This is a stat from 2005, but my understanding is it's increased substantially since then. And there was a really interesting experiment that they tried in Bologna with senior citizens. There was a foundation there that basically provided the money that went to nonprofits that cared for the seniors, and you know, and a lot of seniors and families were unhappy with the care that was being provided. And so what they did was they decided to switch it up a little bit, and they the foundation gave vouchers to families instead, and they could pick which nonprofits that they wanted to receive their care from. And the result was that the people that profited or did well, I guess I should say, provided better quality, were more innovative, and provided flexibility. And no surprise, the organizations that did the best were the social cooperatives, by far and away. In Japan has a lot of health cooperatives with 3 million members, and there's a really interesting consumers co-op there called the Saikatsu Club, which was started actually by a group of housewives who were unhappy with the quality of milk that they were getting to give to their families. I guess milk at a certain point was really controlled, was of poor quality, and so they formed this small co-op, and now it's grown to be an association of 30 consumer cooperatives with 300,000 members. And they're such a force now in terms of they become even a political force, and they've been able to enforce better health and safety and environmental principles in the people that provide the milk, because they've sort of said there's such an economic force that they're not going to buy from you unless you do this. And probably the most interesting one that I read about were the sex worker co-ops in Calcutta, and that was sort of started by, I think, a physician who was seeing a lot of STDs and diseases, and so went out and you know, trained some peer support workers and engaged people to be, you know, members of this sex worker co-op. And they, contribute small amounts of money. And what's happened is, many of the sex workers are still involved in the sex industry, but the good thing is that they are, I guess, we could get into a long discussion about this, but they are better off in terms that they have some participation, some hope for the future. A lot of them have invested money, some of them have become independent and sent, when they initially did the research about why people want to participate, it was because they wanted to provide a better life for their kids. A lot of them had kids, and or they wanted to purchase a place to live or whatever. And so apparently this co-op is really quite famous in Calcutta. So can fill all kinds of needs. The other thing that I thought was really interesting in terms of cooperative and looking at kind of reciprocity and thinking about supporting one another was what I would call crisis of community. And when you look at what was the big difference between community response between Hurricane Katrina and which happened in sort of August of 2005 or December 2004. I think we all remember the horrible tsunami that affected a lot of Southeast Asia, including Sri Lanka. And, just how the system, it was amazing to me in Katrina. I always thought, this is a first world country, just how the systems broke down and people didn't help each other, and there was a lot of really bad things that happened there. Whereas in Sri Lanka, a lot of organizations got together, community organizations, and it was a very different kind of response to the crisis, I guess. One of the first organizations that organized relief efforts was called Sanasa, which is a very close-knit credit union, very widespread in Sri Lanka. And communities, that organization really galvanized organizations to come together and work very well together. So I think that's quite significant in terms of when you think about a community where versus North America, where it's very much individualistic. And there's been a real decline in what I would call social capital in the 21st century in North America, and a real rise of individualism. So there's less civic engagement, less voting, less people involved in lots of different kinds of social and religious organizations. And research has shown that social capital really is at the heart. If you want a vibrant, healthy community, you really need to have social capital. So we really need to rebuild that through organizations and institutions that develop relationships, reciprocity, and trust. And so I think, co-ops have a unique capacity to build that sense of community and to challenge and reform economic structures. And co-ops replenish social capital because members work together. They develop what, in some of the research I did, people called it civic skills. So it's things like, I thought that was an interesting title. So they were talking about, just all the things that a lot of you have been involved in terms of coming together, like, how making decisions, how much is a share going to cost, and how are we going to organize ourselves, how are we going to work together, how are we going to sort out conflicts, how are we going to mobilize other people, like things like even just organizing the learning circles. So trying to help people to identify their own interests and well-being with that of others. And so I guess my conclusion from this is that I guess, having done all this and thought about it for the last month, I guess I'm even more strongly committed to the idea of cooperatives, because I think it's a unique time in North America and Canada that will allow us to humanize our economy. I like that, the way that John Mustakis articulated that, and I think it's like, we have a chance to kind of make a difference in terms of influencing others in social values and in our marketplace, and being a leader in terms of just showing people that there is a different model that's very viable and can be very successful and resilient.